Billions of dollars. Hundreds of billions, actually, when you add it all up over the decades. That is what the United States and its allies have spent building, developing, testing, marketing, and deploying missile defense systems. Patriot batteries, Iron Dome, THAAD, Arrow, David's Sling, the entire architecture of what the defense industry and the Pentagon have been selling to Congress, to the American taxpayer, to allied governments around the world, is built on a single promise: that these systems work. That when the missiles come, the interceptors go up, and the threat is neutralized. That is the promise. That is what justifies the contracts, the budgets, the political support, and the strategic decisions built around the assumption that missile defense is real and reliable. And then Iran fired, and the whole story started to fall apart in real time on live television in front of the entire world. I'm William Lee. Welcome back to the channel. And today we are getting into something that should be front page news in every major newspaper in this country, but somehow keeps getting buried under the noise. We are talking about Professor Theodore Postol, Ted Postol, one of the most technically credentialed and most relentlessly honest analysts of missile technology and defense systems in the world, a former scientific advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations at the Pentagon, a professor emeritus at MIT, a man who has been challenging the official narrative on missile defense for over 30 years, and who has paid a professional price for that honesty because the people writing the checks do not like what he has to say. And what he has been saying about the Iranian missile attacks on Israel, and about what those attacks revealed about the actual performance of U.S. and Israeli missile defense systems, is one of the most important and most suppressed technical stories of this entire conflict. So, today we are going deep. We are going to walk through what Postol has found, what the evidence actually shows about missile defense performance during the Iranian strikes, why this matters so enormously for U.S. strategy and taxpayer money, and what the implications are for every assumption Washington has been making about its ability to fight and win a war in the Middle East. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to see the missile defense story completely differently, and you are going to be angry that more people aren't talking about this openly. Let's start with who Ted Postol is and why his voice carries the weight it does, because this is not someone you can dismiss easily. And believe me, certain people have tried very hard to dismiss him. Postol spent years working at the highest levels of the U.S. national security establishment. He has a doctorate in nuclear engineering from MIT. He was a science and policy advisor inside the Pentagon during some of the most consequential years of the Cold War arms race. He has published peer-reviewed technical analyses of ballistic missile systems, interceptor technology, and radar performance that are cited by serious defense researchers around the world. He is not an activist with a political agenda who learned missile technology on YouTube. He is one of the genuine technical authorities on this subject, and when he says a missile defense system failed, he is not guessing. He is reading the physics, analyzing the imagery, examining the observable data, and applying 4 decades of expertise to what he sees. And what he saw during the Iranian missile attacks on Israel did not match what the official statements were saying, not even close. To understand the argument Postol is making, you need a little bit of background on how missile defense systems are supposed to work, and I promise to keep this accessible. When a ballistic missile is fired, whether it's a Shahab, a Fatah, a Khaybar-Shikan, whatever variant Iran is using, it follows a trajectory. It goes up, it reaches a peak, and it comes down. The interception window is narrow and technically demanding. The interceptor missile has to be launched at the right moment, travel to the right point in space, and physically destroy or detonate close enough to the incoming warhead to neutralize it. The entire system depends on radar tracking the incoming threat accurately, a fire control computer calculating the intercept point correctly, and the interceptor actually reaching that point and performing as designed. That chain has to work perfectly, every single time, against every incoming threat. One weak link breaks the whole system. What Postol has argued for decades, and what his analysis of the Iranian strikes dramatically reinforced, is that the publicly claimed success rates of missile defense systems are significantly, sometimes catastrophically, overstated. And the mechanisms by which they are overstated are not accidental. They are systematic. They are built into how the Pentagon and defense contractors define success, how they design tests, how they report results, and how they communicate performance to Congress and the public. Here is one of the core technical problems Postol identifies. When an interceptor missile is fired at an incoming ballistic missile and an explosion occurs in the sky, the defense establishment very often counts that as a successful intercept. But an explosion near a target is not the same as a destroyed warhead. A ballistic missile warhead is a hardened, dense object. The interceptor doesn't need to just get close. It needs to destroy the warhead, not just the missile body. Postol's analyses of debris fields, of what falls to the ground after these intercepts, of the video evidence that can be examined examined frame by frame, consistently show something deeply troubling. In many cases, the warheads come down largely intact. The intercept may have destroyed parts of the missile. It may have detonated the fuel. It may have created a spectacular explosion that looks great on radar and in news footage. But the thing that actually kills people, the warhead, continues on its trajectory and hits the ground. This is not a minor technical quibble. This is the difference between a defense system that works and a defense system that creates an illusion of working while the actual threat gets through. And during the Iranian missile salvos against Israel, Postol examined the evidence that was publicly available, the imagery, the impact sites, the physical damage on the ground, and his conclusions were stark. The performance of the Israeli and U.S.-supplied interceptor systems was dramatically worse than what was being reported in official statements and in the mainstream media coverage that simply repeated those statements without any independent technical scrutiny. Let me be specific about what the Iranian attacks actually involved, because the scale and sophistication matters for understanding how significant the defense failure was. Iran did not fire a handful of crude missiles. In the major attack in April of 2024, Iran launched over 300 drones and missiles simultaneously, a combination of slower cruise missiles, faster ballistic missiles, and hypersonic glide variants. This was a deliberately designed saturation attack. The logic of saturation is straightforward and lethal. If you fire enough projectiles of enough different types at enough different angles and speeds, you overwhelm the capacity of the interceptor inventory and the fire control systems to handle every threat simultaneously. The defense side has to make triage decisions. Some things get targeted, some things get through. The official Israeli and American narrative after that April attack was a triumph. 99% interception rate, they said. Nearly all of the threats were neutralized. The system worked exactly as designed. It was a historic demonstration of integrated air defense. That is what you heard on CNN, on Fox, on MSNBC, from the Israeli military spokesman, from the White House, a near-perfect performance. Postol looked at the same attack and reached a very different conclusion. By examining the impact sites, the ground damage, the physical evidence of what actually landed on Israeli territory, and the trajectory data that could be inferred from publicly available information, he found that a significant number of Iranian ballistic missile warheads successfully penetrated the defense and impacted their targets. Not zero, not one or two, a meaningful number. The reason this didn't translate into the mass casualty event, it could have been involved several factors. The specific targets Iran chose, the geographic dispersion, the hardening of certain military facilities, and yes, some genuine intercepts that did function as claimed. But the foundational claim that the defense system stopped virtually everything, Postol says that is not what the evidence shows. Now, why does this matter so profoundly? Let me count the ways, because this isn't just an academic exercise in technical accuracy. First, it matters because of the money. The United States has invested somewhere in the range of $300 billion in missile defense systems over the last 4 decades, depending on how you count and what you include. That alone costs approximately $1 billion per battery. Patriot PAC-3 interceptors cost about $4 million each. Every time one of these interceptors is fired, that's $4 million leaving the arsenal. During the Iranian attacks, Israel and the United States fired significant numbers of these interceptors. If the intercept rate is dramatically lower than claimed, then the cost-exchange ratio, the economic logic of the entire system, collapses. Iran spent a few $1,000s per drone, maybe a few $100,000 per ballistic missile. The United States and Israel spent millions per interceptor. If the effectiveness is not what is claimed, then the attacker has an enormous and sustainable economic advantage, and the defender is burning through expensive inventory at a rate that cannot be sustained over a prolonged conflict. Second, it matters because of strategic decisions built on false assumptions. The entire U.S. and Israeli approach to deterrence in the Middle East has been built, in part, on the assumption that missile defense provides a meaningful shield. That assumption justifies a more forward-leaning, more aggressive posture. If you genuinely believe your missile defense will stop 80 or 90 or 99% of what comes at you, your calculation about the acceptable risk of provoking retaliation is very different than if you believe 10 or 20 or 30% of incoming missiles will get through. Military planners make decisions based on these numbers. Political leaders make decisions based on these numbers. If the numbers are wrong, the decisions built on them are built on sand. Third, it matters because of the arms race dynamics it creates. If missile defense doesn't work as advertised, then the massive investment in offensive missile technology that Iran and China and Russia and North Korea have been making is even more strategically valuable than it already appeared. The whole logic of missile defense investment is that it can outpace offensive missile development and provide a genuine defensive advantage. Postol has been arguing for 30 years that this is a fundamentally flawed premise, that the physics and economics of offense will always outpace defense in this domain, that a sophisticated adversary can always develop countermeasures and saturation strategies faster and cheaper than the defense can respond. The Iranian attacks provided real-world validation of that argument at a scale and visibility that is very hard to explain away. Fourth, and this one is critical, it matters because of the political cover that inflated success claims provide to the people making decisions about escalation. If you are a political leader and your military and defense establishment tells you that your missile defense performed at 99% effectiveness, you walk away from that attack feeling emboldened. You think, we can absorb this. Our shield held. We can afford to push harder. But if the actual number is dramatically lower than that, if a meaningful percentage of Iranian warheads actually reach their targets, then your risk assessment for the next escalatory step is completely wrong. You are making a decision about whether to escalate based on a false sense of your own protection, and that false confidence can lead you somewhere catastrophic. Postol has made this point with real urgency. He is not just a technical critic picking apart test methodologies in obscure journals. He is warning loudly and publicly that the misrepresentation of missile defense performance is creating a dangerous disconnect between the risk tolerance of political leaders and the actual vulnerability of the populations they govern. When leaders believe the shield works, they are more willing to provoke attacks. When attacks come and the shield doesn't perform as promised, the consequences fall on civilians and soldiers, not on the defense contractors who sold the system or the officials who misrepresented its capabilities. Let's talk about the history of this, because the Iranian attacks did not reveal something new. They dramatically and publicly confirmed something that Postol has been documenting for over 3 decades. Go back to the Gulf War in 1991. The Patriot missile system was deployed against Iraqi Scud missiles and celebrated as a triumph. The Army claimed an 80% success rate. President George H.W. Bush visited Patriot batteries and called them technological marvels. It became a defining image of that war, the interceptor missiles streaking up into the Saudi and Israeli skies. Postol, working from MIT with access to radar tapes and ground damage assessments, produced a technical analysis that concluded the actual success rate of the Patriot against Scuds was somewhere close to 0, not 80%, 0. The intercepts that occurred were largely intercepts of the Scud missile body after it had already broken apart during re-entry, not the warhead, which continued on its trajectory unimpeded. The explosions in the sky were real. The protection was not. The Army disputed his findings. There were congressional hearings, there were charges and countercharges. And then, years later, internal Army assessments that had been classified were eventually released, and they showed that Postol's technical critique was substantially correct. The official success rate had been enormously overstated. The political will to tell the public the truth about what they were spending their money on simply wasn't there. Fast forward through the 1990s, through the 2000s, through repeated tests of THAAD and ground-based mid-course defense, where the tests were designed with the target trajectory fed to the interceptor in advance. In other words, tests that no real enemy attack would ever replicate. And you see the same pattern. Claimed success, Postol critique, defense establishment pushback, gradual acknowledgement that the performance was worse than advertised, no accountability, continued funding. The Iranian war has just done this on a much larger, much more consequential, much more visible stage, and the stakes are proportionally higher. I want to get into the political economy of why this keeps happening, because it's not a mystery and it's not a conspiracy. It's actually pretty transparent if you look at the incentives involved. The missile defense industry in the United States is enormous and politically powerful. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. These are the companies that build and profit from missile defense contracts. They employ people in dozens of congressional districts. Their lobbyists are some of the best connected in Washington. Their executives cycle in and out of Pentagon leadership positions through the revolving door that defines the military-industrial complex. When Postol or anyone else publishes findings that suggest these systems don't work as advertised, the institutional response is not to investigate honestly and correct the record. The institutional response is to protect the program, protect the budget, protect the relationships that keep the whole ecosystem functioning, and the politicians who oversee the defense budget have their own incentives. Nobody wants to be the senator who voted to cut the missile defense budget and then faces attack ads asking why they left America vulnerable. Nobody wants to be the defense official who told the truth about Patriot performance and then watched the political firestorm that followed. The incentive structure at every level, contractor, Pentagon, Congress, White House, points in the same direction. Overpromise, claim success, challenge the critics, move on to the next budget cycle, repeat. Postol is one of the few people with the technical credentials to credibly challenge this system and the professional courage to keep doing it year after year despite the institutional resistance. He was denied security clearances, his findings were disputed through official channels that had far more resources and far more institutional backing than a single MIT professor working from open source data. But the open source data, in the age of satellite imagery and social media and commercial intelligence platforms, is more powerful than it has ever been. And Postol knows how to read it. What does all of this mean for the future of U.S. military strategy in the Middle East and beyond? It means that the strategic architecture built around the assumption of missile defense reliability needs to be fundamentally re-examined. The U.S. has based its posture in the Pacific, its plans for a potential conflict with China over Taiwan, partly on missile defense systems that may not perform as the planning assumptions require. The U.S. has been selling allied nations on missile defense as a cornerstone of their security architecture. South Korea, Japan, the Gulf states, Poland, Romania, all of these countries have made defense investments and policy decisions based on the advertised performance of American missile defense technology. If that technology performs dramatically worse than advertised under real-world conditions, then the entire web of deterrence relationships built on that foundation is weaker than anyone in those governments has been told. And here's the thing about Iran specifically. Iran has studied missile defense for decades. They have invested heavily in ballistic missile programs precisely because their strategic doctrine is built around the ability to penetrate missile defenses. The Fatah hypersonic missile, the Khaybar-Sheikhan, the various maneuvering re-entry vehicle designs that Iran has developed, these are specifically engineered to defeat intercept systems. They are designed to fly unpredictable trajectories, to maneuver in the terminal phase, to approach from angles and at speeds that stress the radar and fire control systems beyond their design parameters. Iran did not stumble into building missiles that can defeat U.S. missile defense. They did it on purpose, and Postol's argument is that they succeeded. That is not a comfortable conclusion for Washington, but it is the honest conclusion. And here is the broader point that Postol keeps coming back to that I think is the most important takeaway from his entire body of work. A defense establishment that cannot be honest with itself about the performance of its systems cannot make good decisions about war and peace. When the intelligence about weapons effectiveness is corrupted, not by enemy deception, but by domestic political and economic incentives, then the strategic decisions built on that intelligence are corrupted too. You get wars started on the assumption of easy victory. You get escalations launched on the assumption of adequate protection. You get a gap between the world as decision makers believe it to be and the world as it actually is. And in a conflict involving missiles and potentially nuclear weapons, that gap is not just a policy problem, it is an existential risk. Postol is 70-something years old. He has been making this argument since before many of the people now running the Pentagon were out of college. He has been right repeatedly, and he has been ignored, sidelined, and disputed repeatedly. The Gulf War Patriot performance, the Clinton-era national missile defense debates, the Iraq War and the WMD intelligence failures that had structural similarities to the missile defense credibility problem, the repeated THAAD tests designed to succeed, and now the Iranian strikes and the gap between official claims and observable reality. The pattern is consistent. The lesson is consistent. The question is whether anyone with actual power is paying attention. I want to be transparent with you about something because I think you deserve the full picture. There are serious defense analysts who dispute aspects of Postol's conclusions. They argue that his methodology for assessing warhead impacts is not as reliable as he claims. They argue that some of the publicly available evidence he relies on is ambiguous and can be interpreted differently. They argue that the official reporting, while sometimes optimistic in its framing, is not as systematically fraudulent as Postol suggests. Those are real debates happening among real experts, and they should not be dismissed. Defense policy is genuinely complicated, and the fog of an active conflict makes independent technical assessment extraordinarily difficult. But here's what is not genuinely disputed, and I want to be crystal clear about this. The history of missile defense performance claims being significantly overstated is not a Postol invention. It is documented in congressional testimony, in declassified assessments, in the work of the Government Accountability Office, in peer-reviewed academic literature. The gap between the performance missile defense systems deliver in carefully scripted tests and the performance they deliver in real-world conditions against sophisticated adversaries is real, acknowledged by people well within the mainstream of the defense community, and enormously consequential. Postol argues it is larger than even the mainstream critics acknowledge. That is where the genuine debate lies, not over whether overpromising has happened, but over how severe it is and what to do about it. And the Iranian conflict has just given the world the most significant real-world data point on that question in decades. How that data is analyzed, who is allowed to analyze it with credibility, whether honest analysis gets through the institutional filters that protect the defense industry's narrative. All of that is going to shape the strategic lessons that the United States draws from this conflict. If Washington draws the wrong lessons, if it accepts the 99% narrative and moves forward with unchanged assumptions about missile defense reliability, then the next escalation will be built on the same false foundation. And in a conflict with the stakes of a direct US-Iran war, or a Taiwan scenario, or a NATO-Russia confrontation, the cost of that false foundation will not be measured in wasted billions. It will be measured in something far worse. I'm William Lee. Ted Postol has been ringing this alarm for 30 years, and too few people in power have listened. Maybe that's starting to change. Maybe the scale and visibility of the Iranian attacks will finally force the kind of honest reckoning that previous failures didn't. Or maybe the institutional incentives are just too strong, the money too big, the political risks of honesty too high. I genuinely don't know. But I know we should be having this conversation loudly and publicly, and that is what this channel is here for. Tell me in the comments, do you think missile defense is the fraud Postol says it is? Do you think we've been sold a very expensive lie? Or do you think the systems work well enough and the critics are being unfair? I want the debate in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell, and I will see you in the next one.